This week, in week 1 of this course, we're going to be talking about and thinking about Socrates. And we can't think about Socrates, of course, without also thinking about Socrates' pupil and the thinker who is responsible for, in fact, everything we know about Socrates, and that is Plato. Socrates himself, although he's often thought to be one of the earliest philosophers, and indeed we have a lot of accounts of his life that tell us about the kind of questioning, inquisitive and critical person Socrates was. We know all of this, but yet we don't actually have anything that Socrates actually wrote down himself. So everything that we know about Socrates comes to us from the writings of his pupil, Plato. And two writings of Plato that involve Socrates that we're going to be looking at this week are the Apology and the Allegory of the Cave. And both of these are in chapter 1 of the textbook. So these are the two readings that we're going to focus on this week, and we're going to have a look at those. Like I said, they're both in the textbook, and we're going to try and get a sense of Socrates and get a sense of his idea of philosophy. And this is very important because Socrates is and of course Plato as well are often thought to be at the very foundation of Western philosophy. That a lot of, if not all, Western philosophy comes directly from both Plato and through Plato's Socrates. So Plato and Socrates are very important. We're going to start by trying to get an idea of these two texts. The Apology tells us about the trial of Socrates, the trial in 399 BC, when Socrates was tried and subsequently executed. And the Apology gives an account of what Socrates said at his trial. The Allegory of the Cave is a very small part of a much larger book, perhaps Plato's most famous book, and that is the Republic. And the Allegory of the Cave is a small sort of self-contained allegory within this book. And we'll talk a little bit in this lecture about what an allegory is and how it's supposed to work and that sort of thing. So I'll try to guide you through these readings, and with the help of this you should be able to read the text and to be better suited yourself to look at the text and try and get a clearer idea of what is actually going on in the text and what Plato is trying to do. So we're going to start with the Allegory of the Cave. Plato's cave allegory in the first paragraph describes a very vivid scenario, a very vivid picture for us of this situation where we're told that there are prisoners in a cave. Prisoners in a cave who are chained. They've been there since childhood. Not only are they chained, but they can't move their heads. In other words, they're chained in such a way that they can only look forward in front of them. So they can't see what's going on behind them. So the prisoners are chained because they've been there since childhood. We're told that tells us that they don't know anything else other than this reality, this situation. This is their reality. This is what life is for the prisoners. They don't have anything to contrast it from. We could even say perhaps they don't realize that they are prisoners if they don't have any concept, any idea of what it would mean to be free, to not be prisoners. We're also told that behind them there is a fire. There is a fire shining behind the prisoners. In front of the fire there is a sort of a raised wall or a raised way or a bridge. And across the wall there are figures or people who are carrying puppets or marionettes. These things cast a reflection. And the reflection cast by the light of the fire reflects a shadow onto the wall in front of the prisoners. And the shadows cast by these things are what the prisoners actually see. So the prisoners are sitting there. They don't, of course, see the sunlight at all. The sunlight is outside the cave, but there is a light in the cave that's produced by the light of the fire. And it's the fire that casts the shadows from these objects being carried across this roadway where puppets or marionettes are sort of held by performers. It's the shadow cast there that is seen by the prisoners. So the prisoners see those shadows. So this is the scenario Plato tells us. And we've got to figure out, when we look at this, what is going on here, what we are being told, what this scenario is all about, what we're supposed to take from it. What we have here is just the surface level of what is actually going on in the allegory, what the different parts are, and what Plato actually describes to us. What we've got to do is to get behind this surface and to try and figure out what the deeper meaning is of what this text is all about. We've got to try and figure out what this deeper meaning is, what Plato wants to tell us, what he wants us to take from this allegory, what are we supposed to understand. And as we'll see, it is something very, very clear and very direct, very challenging in fact, that Plato wants us to take from this allegory. Now, before we actually get into the deeper meaning and unpacking the allegory, let's just think for a minute about why somebody might construct an allegory in the first place. An allegory is when you tell a story by using other illustrations, pictures, images, etc. to get something across. So instead of just sort of telling somebody, giving somebody a concept or an idea, you try to illustrate that idea by using figurative or imaginative language. There are a lot of examples in literature, such as George Orwell's Animal Farm. A lot of examples in the Bible, the Christian Bible, especially is full of allegories that are supposed to illustrate a hidden message, a hidden meaning. So the allegory might, for example, try to get across a moral principle that's supposed to be illustrated, that somebody wants us to accept. So there are a number of reasons why you might tell a story by constructing an allegory rather than simply stating something directly. If you think about it, an allegory is a way of sort of indirectly stating something. Instead of just saying, look, this is the situation, what an allegory does is to say, I'm going to present what I want you to take from this in an indirect way, and you've got to try to use the allegory to figure out what I'm trying to say. Now there's a number of reasons, like I said, why somebody might resort to this type of presentation. Why might you construct an allegory? One of the most obvious is to avoid possible social or political persecution. In other words, if by saying something directly you would get into a lot of trouble, maybe even arrested, put in jail, or persecuted in some way by saying something, you may want to disguise what you say by saying it in an allegory, so that instead of actually sort of saying it, you present it as a fairy tale, a metaphor, or just make it less direct. So that's one very obvious reason why you might tell an allegory. A second, and something that's often considered very important, is that an allegory makes something more vivid. It brings something to life by illustrating it. And we can think of, for example, how you can sort of illustrate something by creating a picture, by creating a very vivid image that really brings something in front of us. Whereas if you just sort of stated it, it wouldn't be realized. And we often, when we often sort of talk to children or try to give them to try to get something across to them, we tell them a story instead of just saying, look, it's wrong to do this, or you shouldn't do this. We tell them a story to illustrate what we're trying to say, to make it more vivid, to make it come alive for them. But a lot of stories for adults and in other situations as well use that principle of trying to illustrate something by making it vivid, by creating a picture, by telling a story about it. So that's very important. Now the last one I think is key for making sense of what Plato is up to in the Allegory of the Cave. And the way that I put that here is that we construct an allegory to overcome the resistance we put up when we encounter an idea that is uncomfortable for us. Now, the idea here is that if somebody were to tell us something and say, look, this is this is the truth. This is the truth about you, or this is what I want you to understand. I'm going to state what I want you to know. If somebody just says that to us, well, if it's an idea that is uncomfortable for us, that we want to reject, maybe it hurts us or it harms us in some way, or we're afraid of the idea, we're just going to say, no, that's not true. We're going to resist. We're going to resist accepting that idea, right? So, if we can construct an allegory that, instead of just telling us so that we can resist it, if we can construct an allegory that somehow makes it come alive and gets behind our resistance, makes us see it more clearly, makes us see the truth about it, then that's a really important motive for creating an allegory, right? In other words, we don't want to state the idea directly, because then it's easy for us to say, no, that's not true, right? That's not the truth about us. That couldn't possibly be true. Whereas, if we make it vivid, there's a chance that people might see the truth. There's a chance that we might break down the resistance that people in general, maybe ourselves, have to accept a particular idea. That is a really important motivation for not saying something directly, but saying it by constructing an image, a picture, or in general an allegory. Now, I think support for that idea becomes clearer when we think about the question which should strike us here when we look and we try and get at the deeper meaning. We try to go a little bit behind the surface, and we want to ask, well, who are these prisoners supposed to be? What is this situation supposed to represent? Why does Plato tell us about these strange prisoners in a cave? Who are they? Why should we care about them? And there's a very revealing little exchange on near the beginning of the dialogue, in fact, when Glaucon says, in response to Socrates' portrayal of the prisoners in the cave, Glaucon says, "You have shown me a strange image, and they are strange prisoners." Socrates replies, "Like ourselves." In other words, who are the prisoners? They are us. It's ourselves. It's us, all of us, human beings in general, insofar as they live in society, who are supposed to be the prisoners in a cave. In other words, when Socrates portrays this situation to us and tells us, here are prisoners in a cave who are chained, he's trying to make vivid what he takes to be something essential to our existence in human society. He's telling us that we, insofar as we are in that society, are like prisoners in a cave. Now, at the very start of the allegory, he says, I'm going to paint you a picture of our nature insofar as it is enlightened or unenlightened. So what we can take is that this idea of, this image of us as being prisoners in a cave is something that applies to us insofar as we are unenlightened. For Socrates, insofar as we do not have philosophy, insofar as we do not have the tools of philosophy, that we cannot think philosophically, so far as we do not have that, we are like prisoners in a cave. So that is what Socrates wants to, through Plato of course, what Socrates wants to tell us here, and what comes across through the allegory. So the whole thing is a portrayal of human nature as it is without philosophy, without the liberation of philosophical thinking. And Socrates says it's like being prisoners in a cave. So let's try and get a little deeper into this and think about what that claim actually represents and what it might be all. There's something important about truth or knowledge that comes through here in the way that Socrates, through Plato, develops this allegory. At one point Glaucon says, to them, meaning the prisoners, the truth will be literally nothing but the shadows of the images. If we remember that in the cave, the prisoners see shadows of images cast by the fire. So they don't see the things themselves. They don't see what things actually are like. They see images of things. Perhaps they only see partial images of things. They only see an aspect of things. They only see a part of things as it's presented to them. Perhaps even it's more sinister than that. Perhaps people have an aspect of things presented to them, and they take that to be what things really are like. Perhaps, in other words, there is some manipulation going on here, whether deliberate or just unintentional, a part of the general workings of things, we can't say yet. However, it does seem to be that we are removed from things themselves, insofar as we only see images of things, not the things themselves. The world as it is made available to our senses, Socrates wants to tell us, is not what the world itself is really like. In other words, the world that we live in, the world that is constructed for us, our social world and the opinions and beliefs that are part of this world, is not the world as it is in truth. The world as it is in truth, the world in itself, is not the same thing as the world that we live in as members of society. And that's a central distinction that Socrates wants to get across to us here. Now, to really unpack the deeper meaning at stake here, to really figure this out, we need to get to the bottom of the question of when we actually see images. And again, the idea behind the allegory is that we don't see the things themselves, we see images of things. We never get to the point where we can actually, like the prisoners, where we're incapable of turning around and really seeing what things are like. Instead, we see aspects of things as they are presented to us. So, let's do a little thought experiment here and think about when we see images in our daily life. In other words, is it true for us as representative human beings living in society? Is it true for us that we see images of things like the prisoners rather than things themselves? Is that generally true about us? Well, let's think about some of the aspects, some of the areas in which we can say that our world, the world that we live in, is ruled by images, is governed by the creation and the construction of images. Well, of course, one obvious example of that is advertising, which does nothing except create images of things that are supposed to be attractive to us. And the point of advertising, of course, when it works, is to make us identify with something, create a bond between us and an object or a commodity. Create a bond between us and something, to create a feeling of longing in us for a particular product. It wants to create an image around that product, to give it a certain persona, to give it an identity that we can identify with. So we create an image. We associate that commodity, that thing, with things that will appeal to us, right? Either it's very strong, or it's forceful, or it's attractive, or it has some feature that we want to get hold of, right? It makes us feel better about ourselves even when we possess it, when we wear it, if it's an automobile, when we drive it. So we're encouraged to identify with these images. However, we have to bear in mind, and this is the important thing, they are images. Advertising creates images that are supposed to entice us to identify with a product. But it's not the product itself, it's the image, it's what's created that we identify with. And the same, of course, could be said more generally about television, which of course creates images. And we can see this in a variety of ways. If we think of television news, of course, which, depending, of course, on whether it's cable channels or local channels or whatever, but in any case, the news separates and divides up a news item and gives it looks at it from a certain angle, looks at it from a point of view. And so we're always given an image of, say, a conflict or an incident or an accident or whatever is on the news. We're always given it from a certain point of view, a certain perspective. We only see an aspect of it as it's presented to us on the news. And of course, whatever it is that's on television, it's always something that has been constructed and created. It's been put into a form that is packaged in such a way that it appeals to us. In other words, we're dealing in the realm of images. And of course, another realm where images are all over the place is politics. And we can say this point, I think generally, that politics is one of the primary realms where we create images about ourselves and about ourselves in relation to other people. And whichever country we live in, politics thrives on images about what kind of people we are, about what kind of lives we lead, about how we are, how virtuous we are, how moral we are in relation to other people. So we create an image of our national identity through politics. And of course politics feeds upon this national identity. It feeds upon this sense of who we are. And of course politicians are experts in creating images of whether it be working families, or whatever the particular image, whether it be ordinary people, ordinary Americans, as the phrase often goes here. Politicians create an image of what that ordinary person is like and the troubles facing that person in order to construct a particular political platform. So obviously images are all over the place in politics. Religion is another realm where images are fundamental. Not only in different forms of worship, but in terms of how religions understand themselves. They use images constantly to understand their message and to encourage people to relate to them in certain ways in terms of certain kinds of behavior. So all religions are associated with certain kinds of images. Finally, and I think importantly, we can think in our daily lives about how we create images of the people we see. Sometimes we create images of people, in fact I think we do it all the time, that we think that we understand somebody from, say, meeting them once or seeing them on the subway. We create an image of what we think that person is like. We think that we know that person. Perhaps we even categorize them. Perhaps we could even say we stereotype them. We put them into a certain group. And we do that instinctively. We almost automatically we group and categorize people. We create an image of things that we associate with that person when we see them. So this is another important way in which we create an image. Instead of actually seeing the person, instead of seeing that person as an individual, let's say, instead of seeing their qualities, we create an image. We see an image of them, and we put them into a sort of box, if you like, where the image belongs. And we think that this obviously makes it easier for us, but of course it doesn't really help us to understand. But we live in images in our daily lives, I think, when we interact with other people. And sometimes we can be surprised when the difference between our image of a person and what a person is really like becomes apparent to us. And then it suddenly becomes clear to us that all along we've been seeing an image and not the real person. So we have to live with the truth, and I think this is where Plato is really onto something. Images are everywhere. When we live in human society, images are everywhere and we can't get away from them. And those images do not reflect, certainly do not necessarily reflect, what things are really like. Images are things that we construct so that we can find our way around. Perhaps it's more comfortable for us if we can categorize the world in certain ways. Perhaps it's more comforting for us to see things in certain ways, to personalize things, to categorize, and all of that sort of stuff. And to do that we use images. However, we have to be aware that the world of images is not the world of what things are really like. In fact, it separates us from the world of what things are really like. Now, this ties in directly with the question of why is it difficult for us to leave the cave. Plato wants us to understand that becoming enlightened or educated means learning to live outside the world of shadows. In other words, the world of images that we all construct in our daily lives and that we all live within. This means living without the illusions that often make our lives easier or more comfortable. In other words, it's difficult to leave the cave. And Plato describes it as being, painful. It hurts our eyesight as we try to climb towards the sun, which represents knowledge. Living without those illusions that make our lives easier is the difficult thing about becoming enlightened or becoming educated. That's the difficult thing about learning. It's giving up those illusions. It's learning to live without those comforts that we've become used to, those comfortable illusions that enable us to survive. So education tears us out of that world of shadows, that world of images. And that's why if we come back to the point I made about resistance, that's why it's something that we want to resist. That's why we offer resistance to the idea of education, because it means leaving behind the world of illusions that we've grown comfortable with. It means learning to see things from a completely different perspective, a world that may not be as comfortable for us as the world that we've become suited to, the world that we've grown used to and living within it. So that's why it's difficult to leave the cave. And of course Plato tells us that when somebody who's educated goes back to the cave, what happens? They're ridiculed. They're ridiculed by the people who are still in the perspective for Plato of being prisoners, those people who have never left the cave. And they're ridiculed because they don't live with those illusions, they've left them behind. So they seem strange and ridiculous. They don't value the things that people who still have the illusions value. They don't value those kind of things, the kind of values that are created by images. And that's why there's this big gulf or disparity between what it means to be educated, Plato means of course philosophical education, and the ordinary condition in human society of being a prisoner in a cave. Now let's take a chance to have a think about the Apology. And the Apology, like I said, Socrates' trial, and the Apology is Socrates' defense speech, tells us about Socrates' trial in 399 BC and Socrates' defense of his life in this trial. He's on trial for two things primarily. The first charge is corrupting the youth, and the second charge is believing in gods that are not the gods of the city, or believing in other gods that are not recognized by the city. Those are the two official charges in the indictment brought against Socrates. But it doesn't really get us to the heart of the question of why Socrates was considered dangerous. And to understand this, we have to see why it may be difficult for a society, in fact any society, to accept philosophy. If we think of philosophy as the type of thinking that leads us out of the cave, if philosophy is that type of thinking, then it automatically always challenges our assumptions. It challenges the assumptions that perhaps a society may hold most dear. It challenges our deepest and most sacred assumptions. And that is often threatening. It's often threatening for us to have our assumptions challenged and to have our most fundamental beliefs called into question, to force us to rethink the way that we look at the world. So philosophy, as Socrates presents philosophy, poses a challenge. It poses a challenge to human society. And so there is this conflict, and the Apology dramatizes this conflict between philosophy and human society. That if we're going to be philosophers, if we're going to be educated philosophically, it's quite possible, quite likely, that we are going to come into conflict with organized human society and its beliefs and its belief systems. Now, Socrates is going to defend the role of philosophy nonetheless as an important part of human endeavor and as an important part of human liberation, in fact. So let's take a little bit more of a closer look at the Apology and how Socrates makes this particular argument. Now, the Apology begins with Socrates telling us a story about the Delphic oracle. And the story concerns a friend of Socrates called Chaerephon, who went to the Delphic oracle and was told that there is none wiser than Socrates. Now, Socrates here comes across and tries to present himself as somebody who is very humble, and he tells us that he found that statement very difficult to believe, that he couldn't possibly accept the proposition that there is none wiser than Socrates, and so he sets out to prove that statement wrong. In setting out to prove it wrong, he talks to three groups of people, three groups who he considers to be those who are wise, those who are the wisest in society. He talks to the politicians, the poets, and the artisans. And in the course of speaking to these groups, Socrates tells us that he realized in the end that none of those groups could really be considered wise. Now, what he means by that, he's not saying that they don't know anything. He's not saying that they don't possess specific sorts of knowledge about things. In the case of the artisans, of course, it's very clear that they do possess knowledge about how to do things, whether it's specific skill in carpentry or metalworking or shipbuilding. Those are all very useful skills that involve knowledge. Socrates is talking about something else, and it comes clear when he talks about this difference in knowledge between superhuman knowledge and ordinary human knowledge. What he's talking about is the ability to know the limits of our knowledge, to know that there are things that we don't know. And according to Socrates, that is the fundamental aspect of philosophy. It's of fundamental importance, that if philosophy has knowledge about things, it's not knowledge in the sense that it has information about the world. It can't tell us how to build ships, and it can't tell us how to build shelves and tables and other things. It can't tell us how to construct elaborate buildings. It can't supply new sources of energy. So philosophy doesn't have any specific kind of knowledge base. What it is a way of questioning the knowledge that we have. It's like a process that enables us to get under the things we know and to ask critical questions about the limits of the knowledge that we currently possess. When he talks to the politicians, poets, and artisans, Socrates claims that he knows something in the sense that he knows that there are things of which he is ignorant. In other words, he knows the limits of his knowledge. And that's what he finds missing in these groups of Socrates calls himself a gadfly, and this, I think, sheds important light on what he believes his mission is. He's not just saying that others consider him annoying, like a horsefly, which is what a gadfly essentially is. What he's saying is that his role as a philosopher is to force people to think about things that are uncomfortable for them, to question their ideas and think critically about what they believe. So, as a gadfly, Socrates wants to force people to ask questions. And again, coming back to this point about our resistance to questioning, our resistance to calling things into question, to questioning our lives and changing the things that we believe. Ordinarily, we don't do that. We resist the effort to do that. A gadfly is somebody who is constantly stimulating us to ask those questions, which, although it's uncomfortable for us, is in fact better for us in the end, because that's the only way that we change, that we can develop better beliefs, that we can become more adept at believing things that are closer to the truth, that we can get behind our prejudices and preconceptions. So that's the way that Socrates identifies his gadfly. Now let's think about who might count as other examples of gadflies, thinking that a gadfly is somebody who challenges us in different ways to question the things that we believe. When I ask this question, students often mention Martin Luther King, and of course he's an excellent example of a gadfly, somebody who questioned and forced a society as a whole to question certain assumptions that it had about racial inequalities. And King was instrumental in the United States in bringing about social change, in changing people's assumptions and forcing them to look critically at things that they believed. So I think it's It's an excellent example of somebody who can be considered a gadfly, somebody who forces society to change by forcing it to think critically about itself. Some people often talk about Michael Moore, a more controversial example, but considered somebody who wants to raise questions about us as a society, and somebody who wants us to think critically about ourselves, and particularly the drift of our government and its foreign policy. Nelson Mandela would be another excellent example of a gadfly, somebody who encouraged a dominant group in a society in South Africa to change its ways and to change its assumptions. And of course, his struggle was a long one from the 1960s, lasting about 30 years or so from the time of his imprisonment. However, what's important is that for Nelson Mandela, there was a willingness to do things that would lead to change. In other words, he had very fundamental beliefs about the way a particular society needed to change and to end, in South Africa's case, its apartheid regime. However, Mandela was willing to be more of a realist in his expectations about how that change could be achieved, and about how what would be necessary to bring about that change in a non-violent and peaceful way. So he's an excellent example of how somebody can stimulate change, and stimulate change in a productive and a largely peaceful fashion without violent upheaval. And another example would be Susan B. Anthony, who was instrumental in the United States suffragette movement in the early 20th century. And she was arrested at one time for simply going into a voting booth and voting at a time when voting for women was illegal. So another example, and the suffragette movement as a whole would be an example of somebody questioning society's assumptions and arguing that human equality is fundamental, so fundamental that society needs to reflect on its beliefs about inequality between men and women, and when it's forced to reflect, it must be made aware that there are no good arguments for that equality. So again, the idea of being a gadfly, of changing society's beliefs, of forcing it to reflect critically on the prejudices and preconceptions that lie behind that particular society. Now, as we'll see, Plato is very important for the whole of philosophy and the tradition of Western philosophy. And Plato's idea of philosophy will continue to come up throughout the course, and we'll continue to wrestle with Plato's insights and his view and his definition of what philosophy is like. When we look at epistemology starting next week, we'll draw more systematically, in a more systematic way, the distinction between what things merely seem to be and what they really are. And epistemology, which is really the study of knowledge, or the theory of knowledge, wants to ask this question in a much more rigorous way. So starting with Plato's distinction, we're really going to try and get to the bottom of what it means to say that things as they really are not what things merely seem to be. And once we ask that question, we have to ask the question of epistemology, which is, well, how do we really know things in the first place? How do we have knowledge of anything? How do we have knowledge of the world? Are there things that we know that we don't learn by our experience in the world? If there are, then how do we know those things? So in epistemology, we're going to try to look at that distinction. We're going to try and develop that idea and look at different theories on this subject in this tradition.